Good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to welcome you all to this evening's event, which promises to be a fascinating moment of encounter. Before we begin this evening, I'd like to make a special thank you to Relevant Radio for their collaboration and sponsorship of this event this evening. We also have a special thank you as well to the Research Cluster in Science and Subjectivity that helped organize the event tonight. And we owe a particular debt of gratitude to a great friend there, Professor Bob Pollack. This evening's event, as you know, features a discussion of the Pope's recent encyclical, Laudato Si. Laudato Si, the Pope's second encyclical, was officially published in June of 2015. It takes its title from St. Francis of Assisi's Canticle of the Sun. The canticle is both a poem and a prayer, praising God for his creation in all its many manifestations. Laudato Si means praise be to you in dialect Italian of the time, and the encyclical is subtitled, On Care for Our Common Home. In it, the Pope makes an urgent appeal for how we are shaping the future of our planet. We are particularly fortunate tonight to have two speakers who are experts on the themes of the encyclical. We will first hear this evening from Dr. Jeffrey Sachs. Professor Sachs is widely considered to be one of the world's leading experts on economic development and the fight against poverty. He is, besides many other titles and honorary degrees, more than 20, the director of the Earth Institute, the Cardinal Professor of Sustainable Development, and Professor of Health Policy and Management at Columbia University. He is also Special Advisor to United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon on the Millennium Development Goals. Professor Sachs is also a frequent contributor to major publications such as the Financial Times of London, the International Herald Tribune, Scientific American, and Time magazine. Prior to joining Columbia, Sachs spent over 20 years at Harvard University, most recently as director of the Center for International Development and the Stone Professor of International Trade. A native of Detroit, Michigan, Sachs received his BA, MA, and PhD degrees at Harvard. Cardinal O'Malley. His Eminence Sean Patrick Cardinal O'Malley, a Capuchin, was born in 1944 in Lakewood, Ohio, and raised in Western Pennsylvania, where he entered a Franciscan seminary. At 21, he was professed into the Order of Friars Minor Capuchin, and at 26, he was ordained a Catholic priest. After earning a master's degree in religious education and a PhD in Spanish and Portuguese literature from the Catholic University of America, he taught at Catholic University and founded Centro Católico Hispano, Catholic Hispanic Center in Washington, D.C., an organization which provided educational, medical, and legal help to immigrants. Since his ordination to the episcopacy on August 2nd, 1984, he has served as the Bishop of the Diocese of St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands, Fall River, Massachusetts, quite a climate change, and Palm Beach, Florida. Pope John Paul II appointed him Archbishop of Boston in July of 2003. Pope Benedict XVI named him a cardinal in 2006. On April 13, 2013, Pope Francis appointed Cardinal O'Malley to an advisory board of 8 cardinals to help the Pope govern the Catholic Church and reform its central administration. So without further ado, as a professor, a part-time now teacher of Spanish at Villanova University, I look forward to learning from both of these men this evening.
Thank you very much. An event like this is what's categorized as pure joy. It's a delight to be here, and it's an incredible honor to be with Cardinal O'Malley, and I look forward to our discussion. it's also a joy because Laudato Si is a remarkable encyclical. I think it will be regarded in history as one of the most important encyclicals of modern times. And it comes at a moment of profound importance and significance for the world. It's already had an important effect, a very important effect. We're in a difficult situation globally, as everybody knows. The world is not working very well. It's not working very well socially. It's not delivering even the basic needs of more than 1 billion people on the planet. And at the same time, our economic juggernaut is threatening the planet environmentally. And Pope Francis already in his exhortation, his first message, Evangelii Gaudium, used a phrase that I think is the most powerful, evocative phrase for our time when he said that what we face today is a globalization of indifference, meaning that with all of the profound challenges that we confront, whether it's social exclusion, massive inequalities of income and wealth, huge numbers of young people that are displaced and dislocated and often can't find any foothold other than ending up in gangs or paramilitaries. And with our environmental catastrophe, we can't seem to focus, as what the Pope was saying. And both the exhortation and this encyclical are a remarkably powerful and I think already successful effort to break the indifference and to help people to see what is at stake right now. And I say that it's already had a historic effect because Pope Francis issued this encyclical last summer knowing that the world was immediately to confront two major diplomatic challenges. The first in September of last year when the world leaders got together with the intention of adopting a framework of sustainable development. And the encyclical helped to ensure that that step would be successful. Not only was the encyclical key, but Pope Francis himself opened the General Assembly, as you'll recall, on September 25th, gave a moving and powerful speech to the world leaders, and then moments after, the world leaders unanimously endorsed a new framework called the Sustainable Development Goals, which can serve as a framework for global cooperation for the coming generation. It was just weeks after that, and of course in the shadow of the terrorist attack in Paris, when world leaders assembled again in Paris on November 30th to open up 2 weeks of diplomatic negotiations on climate change. You've probably noticed walking in the building and in our semi-summertime of this New York winter that something's a little weird. And of course, we are in the midst of the warmest period on Earth, probably for, if not only thousands of years, tens of thousands of years. We're deranging the planet. And the world leaders have not been able to find a path forward. And there are powerful interests and massive confusion about this. Pope Francis has been extremely concerned about that failure, and Laudato Si was also directed towards helping all of the world leaders to understand the gravity of the situation and the essential morality, the moral obligation to find a way forward. And as I'm sure you know, on December 12th, last month, all 196 signatories of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, for the first time ever, agreed on how to implement a climate agreement, what's called the Paris Climate Agreement. And I would say, having been part of that process now for several years, that the encyclical played a magnificent role. And it did so in a fundamental way, which I just want to explain briefly. And I'll conclude the opening remark with that. Our greatest problem, expressed by that phrase, the globalization of indifference, is that we're having a very, very hard time on this planet understanding what's truly important for us. We're living in a period of a tremendous technological capacity that makes it possible to do what would seemingly be miraculous things. We really can end extreme poverty on the planet. We can save millions of lives of children who are dying every year of diseases that are now completely controllable with preventable disease or curable diseases. And we can make a transformation of the world's energy system to a climate-safe energy system by shifting from the fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas, to renewable energy and other low-carbon energy sources. So we have the technological means to do this. As an economist, I can tell you we have the economic means easily to do this. Economists don't know very much, except they know how to count money. And I'll tell you the bottom line. Every year, the world economy is producing $110 trillion of output. That's a lot, even to a macroeconomist. And it's by far and away enough to end poverty, fight disease, shift the energy system to safety, end scourges like human trafficking and modern forms of slavery. These are all within reach. It's our heads that have to get straight on this, not our technological choices or breaking the bank economically. And that is the core message of this encyclical, but it's the core message of the Church's social teachings in modern history. And I wanted to conclude by putting this encyclical into a little bit of historical context. And that is, I see this encyclical as a great encyclical on a path that started with 1891 with Rerum Novarum, which was the first social teachings of the Church about Rerum Novarum, about new things. And the new things of Rerum Novarum were the new things of the Industrial Revolution. And the Church made a central assertion back in 1891, which it has carried forward consistently for 125 years. And it's a crucial assertion in my view. And it is that an economy can only function if it functions within a moral framework. A market economy just left to profit seeking will never deliver human benefit by itself. It will run wild. It will empower the too powerful. It will leave the poor to die. It will destroy the natural environment. Unlike what a bad economics textbook 101 would teach about the invisible hand and the market economy, the economy cannot take care of itself except if it's within a moral framework. And the Church has put forward powerful standards, starting with the preferential option for the poor and with the doctrine of the universal destination of goods, which in essence for an economist means private property is for human purpose. It's not sacrosanct, if I may say so. It is a method of institutions, but it doesn't serve as an end in itself. morality has to be the primary standard for how an economy functions. Well, from Rerum Novarum, there have been several profound teachings about how an economy can fit within a moral framework and how statecraft can fit within a moral framework. And I would point to Pacem in Terris in 1963 of Pope John the 23rd, who said that state-to-state relations are not just a game of politics or diplomacy, they also have to operate within a moral framework. And then I had a great honor to be on an advisory team in 1991 in helping to prepare preliminary documents for Centesimus Annus, which was the 100th anniversary of Rerum Novarum, and came at the moment of the end of the communist domination of Eastern Europe, where Pope John Paul II was called upon to give guidance. Is a market economy the right way? And he said, yes, but only within a moral framework, not just a market by itself, a market economy guided by morality. Well, I see Laudato Si in that profound tradition. What Pope Francis is saying here is that the market economy also must live within the boundaries of the physical creation. We cannot destroy the climate, the biodiversity, the Earth's ecosystems, and say that's property rights, that's just a market economy. The economy has to be bound by the fundamental morality of protecting the creation and protecting the planet and furthering human well-being. Now, the encyclical is brilliant in reading, in text, in analysis. I could assign chapter 1 of this encyclical just in the introductory science class, because it is thoroughly, fully science-based on what's happening to the ecosystems, on how to understand climate change, on how to understand the loss of biodiversity. But then it takes that scientific base and, of course, puts it in the moral framework and calls on us finally in the 2 concluding chapters to find what Pope Francis calls a common plan for our common home, and then calls in the final chapter on us to educate each other and young people to understand what it means to live with integral development or sustainable development. Well, as a professor of sustainable development, you can't ask for more than that kind of call. And the world is heeding Pope Francis's call because we are, step by step, finding a way to find that common plan. I have to say, and I have to explain as a UN official to you, in these conferences, there are 193 member states of the UN. There are actually 196 signatories to the Climate Convention. If any one country stands up and objects under the rather odd rules of the game, that can stymie everything. So when you reach an agreement, as was reached in Paris on December 12, I don't know if I'm speaking technically, but I'll say it was a small miracle. And it was a miracle that had inspiration from Laudato Si. That's why we're here tonight enjoying this wonderful document.
Thank you very much. And now I turn the mic over to Cardinal O'Malley.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Thank you, Professor Sachs. And we want to thank the organizers, the Encuentro, for bringing us here to reflect on this very important topic. I often share with people the story of a Jesuit and a Franciscan who are walking down the street one day and confronted by a young man who says, "Fathers, what novena do I have to make to get a BMW?" And the Franciscan said, "What's a BMW?" And the Jesuit said, "What's a novena?" Well, we're very blessed with a pope who is a Jesuit through and through and represents the treasures of Ignatian spirituality, but at the same time is very Franciscan. The choice of his name as Francis when he became our Holy Father was a clear signal of what his pontificate was going to be about. We see in Francis a man who had such an awareness of the fatherhood of God, and that is sort of the central theme in the spirituality of St. Francis, that allowed him to realize that his call was to be a universal brother and to work for peace among all people, to have a very special love for the poor and a love for creation. It's therefore not surprising that the encyclical has been named Laudato Si. It's very unusual. Usually encyclicals have these Latin names from the first phrase in the encyclical. But the Holy Father has chosen the first words of the Canticle of Brother Sun, which, by the way, is probably the first piece of Italian literature in history, because prior to that, everything was written in Latin, and certainly it's the oldest Italian writing that we have, that the Holy Father is quoting from this beautiful canticle, as Rebecca spoke to us about, that St. Francis wrote actually when he was very sick. He was in a little hut that St. Clare and the sisters had built for him at San Damiano. He was already blind. St. Francis died very young, and he lost his sight long before he died. So this is a man talking about the beauties of creation, but seeing that beauty in his heart, because with his eyes he could no longer see it. And when he died in 1226, he wanted to die lying naked on the ground at the Porziuncola, and asked the friars to sing this song to him. And they added a phrase after calling upon Brother Sun and Brother Moon and Sister Water and Brother Fire to praise God. They added a verse about Sister Death, because Francis saw death as not something terrible, but someone who ushers us into God's presence. And so the Holy Father has chosen the name that is this hymn of communion of creation. And I'm sure that when the Holy Father first announced this encyclical, all of us thought, well, this is going to be a great gift to the Church, and it will make us feel very proud to be Catholics. But in the months since the encyclical has been released, I've come to see that Laudato Si as a gift not just to the Church, but to the whole world. And the broader source of the significance of the encyclical has come in part from the way that the secular media, the academic and scientific community, and the public in general have received the words of Pope Francis. A typically striking example of this reception was a quote from the Guardian newspaper in London, which called the encyclical the most astonishing and perhaps the most ambitious papal document of the past 100 years. One of the secular publishers which released the document invited Professor Noemi Oreskes, a professor of history of science at Harvard, to write an introduction. And she begins saying, "Sometimes, however, a book catalyzes thought into action. Uncle Tom's Cabin did this, and so did The Silent Spring. Like these works, Pope Francis's encyclical is a call to action. that insists that we embrace the moral dimensions of problems that have hitherto been viewed primarily as scientific, technological, and economic. My intention tonight is not to provide a comprehensive assessment of this compelling teaching document. Rather, I wish to lift up some pieces of the encyclical, encouraging you to pursue their meaning in a greater depth. Specifically, I will comment on how this encyclical fits into the longer tradition of Catholic social teaching that the professor has already mentioned. Then I will highlight this distinctive moral analysis which Francis provides for addressing the challenge of environment. And finally, I will focus on the particular religious resources which the Holy Father offers all of us, Catholics, Christians, religious traditions, and others, drawn to this vital issue, but not related in our religious convictions. Laudato Si and the Catholic social teaching. Pope Francis locates his reflection on the environment crisis solidly in the lives of his immediate predecessors on the chair of Peter. Citing Pope St. John Paul II and Pope Benedict, often he illustrates that this encyclical is not the first time that the Church has addressed the environment. To be sure, he's correct, but it's also useful to point out that in the 125 years of social teaching, reaching from Leo XIII through Pope Benedict, the issue of environmental challenge as a religious moral question has not received the kind of attention that issues of social justice, human rights, war, and peace have received from the magisterium. Indeed, Pope Francis uses an interesting analogy, which I will expand upon. In the preface to the encyclical, he notes that after the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1963, at a time of great danger in the Cold War, Pope John XXIII wrote the famous peace encyclical, Pacem in Terris. Francis describes his letter as a similar initiative. My comment on this comparison is meant to stress the significance of Laudato Si. The Catholic Church had taught and written about war and peace for well over 1,000 years when Pacem in Terris appeared. But that encyclical put Catholic teaching on peace on an entirely new foundation. I believe that while Francis is not the first pope to address the environment, he's raised the understanding of its significance for Catholics and for the world to an entirely new level. This encyclical will be seen, I believe, as the basis for Catholic engagement on the care of our common home for this century. The characteristics of the letter place it solidly in the Catholic social tradition. Pope Francis uses the resources of revelation with extensive citations and reflections from Hebrew and Christian scriptures. But he also joins these biblical themes with philosophical rigor and with an extensive use of the scientific analysis which has been at the heart of the environmental debate. Again, a quote from a very secular source is interesting. The Washington Post commented on the letter this way: in his masterful grasp of the science behind climate change, the pontiff unmasks himself as a political wonk. A final link of the encyclical with the prior Catholic teaching is Pope Francis's stated intention in his preface. He says, "I urgently appeal then for a new dialogue about how we are shaping the future of this planet. We need a conversation that includes everyone, since the environmental challenge we are undergoing and its human roots concern and affect all of us." This call for dialogue echoes one of the principal statements in the Vatican II's Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World. There the Council stated that the best way for the Church to show respect for the world was to enter into dialogue with it. Moving beyond the general character of the encyclical, I wish to lift up for consideration two sections of the encyclical. First, in chapter 2, the Holy Father offers a reflection on which he calls the gospel of creation. That is fascinating, I would say original reflection. It is tightly written with biblical theological meditation on how believers can approach this question of our relation to creation. He calls believers to think of a triad of relationships of each of us with God, our neighbor, and creation. While personalizing the question in this way, Francis always keeps in the forefront of his definition of the environmental issues the social dimension of our existence. We face this problem as a global human community, even though decisions about it are made often through sovereign states, as was the case at the recent Paris summit of the United Nations. In the midst of his theological reflection, Pope Francis makes an important commentary on the Christian tradition and the environment. In the creation account in the book of Genesis stands the human person made in the image of God. The dignity of the person is at the heart of Catholic social teaching, and it lies at the center of the Pope's encyclical. But he goes on to point out that the Genesis mandate to the person is to exercise dominion over the earth, has at times been interpreted without proper restraint. Hence, in some discussions of the environmental challenge, Christians are seen as part of the problem. The Pope goes on to acknowledge that we Christians have at times incorrectly interpreted the Scriptures. But he says today we must forcefully reject the notion that our being created in God's image has given dominion over the earth justifies absolute dominion over all other creatures. In his own direct style of speaking, the Holy Father says, we are not God. The earth was here before us and has been given to us. In interpreting the idea of our dominion over creation, the key idea is stewardship. We are to think of ourselves as the stewards of God's creation. So dominion must always be exercised within religious and moral limits. Thus, we will be good stewards of what God has entrusted to us, his own work of creation. The idea of balanced exercise of stewardship brings the encyclical to the moral core of the Pope's message. The moral argument about the environment runs through the entire encyclical. It is particularly found in chapters 3 and 4 entitled The Human Roots of the Ecological Crisis and Integral Ecology. I invite and urge you to read Francis's powerful indictment of human activity and the need for a true personal and social conversion. I will only summarize it here. The premise of the Pope's approach, a theme he repeats again and again, is that all things are connected. One of the principal reasons the encyclical has received such praise from diverse quarters is that the Holy Father has provided a moral foundation for others to use in addressing this global crisis. He specifically connects two ideas, poverty and ecology. We have, he argues, not two different questions, but one large challenge. We must confront the environmental crisis because it threatens us all. But in addition, the poor will suffer the greatest effects from a failure to address the environment. As Professor Oreskes nicely summarizes in the encyclical's moral arguments, the core of the argument is that because human dignity finds its roots in our common Creator, caring for one fellow citizen and caring for the environment are the same thing. Respect for creation and respect for human dignity are two aspects of the same idea. The Holy Father's moral critique of the cause of environmental degradation rests squarely on human choices, or as he puts it, the human roots of the ecological crisis. Once again, this argument runs through much of the encyclical. His primary purpose is not so much to allocate the blame as to identify new and needed ways of changing how we think and act. The stress again lies on moral limits. How we set limits on two major dimensions of our common life: technology and the markets. My judgment is that he is not simply against either or both of these institutions of modernity. Rather, he sees both in need of moral direction. Neither technology nor the markets have their own inner ethic. Moral limits to guide the use of both are part of what social morality is about within nations and among nations. In both cases, a basic criterion in deciding how to think about the intersection of ecology, technology, and the markets is their impact on the poor at every level of social life. The Holy Father does not propose his own singular moral solution. Again, he invites dialogue across many sectors: science, politics, business, finance, and at every level of life, local, national, and global. The Holy Father's moral analysis of the environment and poverty lies in this encyclical as the longer socioeconomic teaching of the Catholic social tradition. It also opens multiple questions for further discussion and examination of two issues, poverty and environment, which run from the local to the global, and which are also intergenerational questions. The U.S. discussion and decision-making on these questions will spread out over space and time. Among the many compelling characteristics of Laudato Si is the scope of the Holy Father's vision and words. He joins God and each person, persons in community and social relationships, faith and reason, science and religion, economics and justice at every level of life. And he holds all together in the three relationships he identified at the beginning of his encyclical: God, persons, and nature. It's not surprising, therefore, that his concluding chapter is on spirituality and education. He opens saying, "Many things have to change course, but it is we human beings above all who need to change." The Holy Father describes the change needed as a cultural conversion involving how we think, how we see, and how we act, faced with the double challenge of poverty and the environment. Throughout the encyclical, he's used the resources of faith and reason, the best of theology and the best of science. He has spoken across lines to believers and humanists, to rich and poor, to climate skeptics and committed conservationists. In his concluding words, he focuses on those for whom faith is an abiding dimension of life. In this section, he reflects on how faith sheds light on all dimensions of reality and on all problems, however daunting the scope. His tone is meditative, reflective, and hopeful. Having given us in one chapter the gospel of creation, he called on us in another chapter to an integral ecology. He leaves us with a sketch of how the sacramental life of faith can sustain a way of life which treasures every dimension of God's creation. The sacraments, he reminds us, are a privileged way in which nature is taken up by God to become a means of of mediating supernatural life. Through our worship of God, we are invited to embrace the world on a different plane. It is that embrace which Francis hopes and prays that multiple communities of the world can adopt at different levels of faith and reason. While his final reflections return to Catholics and what he calls us to in belief and action, he is seeking to speak beyond the boundaries of the Church and to save the common home. God has given us to share, to use, to protect, and to heal. Certainly, this encyclical is a great gift. Like the Canticle of Brother Sun of St. Francis, the encyclical is a hymn and a prayer. As a matter of fact, the encyclical ends with a prayer. And I would urge all of you to say that prayer, to study the encyclical, and to help our community to understand what a treasure this is, not just for our church, but for the entire world. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We do have a little bit of time for some discussion now, and I'm interested at first for you, Dr. Sachs. You've read a tremendous volume of material in your life, addressing some of the concerns that the Pope is also talking about here, and I'm wondering, right? Obviously, this is an ecclesial document; it's an encyclical, but it's clear that he's talking about our common home, and he's looking to an audience that's broader than church itself. And I'm wondering, from your vantage point, what you see as the most original contributions of the encyclical on the sort of economy and environment and society in general, things that are, in which you're very well versed already.
I think maybe it would be helpful just to say a word about the preparation of the encyclical, because it was amazing. And of course, the real preparation was Pope Francis writing the encyclical, which we didn't see. But for 3 years, actually, the Pontifical Academy of Sciences and the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences worked very, very hard at bringing the world's top scientists and top development analysts to the Vatican for very serious and deep reflection on these issues. And I want to emphasize that because it's an amazing phenomenon. It's a unique phenomenon. There is no other world religion right now that works in that manner at all, that there's a world-renowned scientific institution, which I was privileged to be part of many meetings for 3 years, where top Nobel laureates, top analysts, at one meeting, the world's mayors were brought to the Vatican. At another, the world's top climate scientists. At yet another, religious leaders from across faiths came. So I think the process is phenomenally interesting, serious, and important, which is that a lot of work goes into this in the church, and science is not viewed as some outside extraneous matter. How could it be? It's viewed as completely integral to even the underlying morality of paying attention to science is fundamental. It can't be in contradiction with the moral questions in general, and that's why this encyclical is seamless between the science, the theology, and the guidance that it gives, which I think is unmatched in any other such text that I know. But it doesn't come easily, and it's not only simply the work of Pope Francis, it's the nature of how the church is working right now. The empowerment of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences and the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences, the brilliant chancellor of those institutions, Bishop Marcelo Sanchez Sorondo, the idea that Pope Francis really encouraged of those institutions, bring the science, study the problem, analyze the problem, is a tremendous, it's so beautifully and seamlessly reflected in this, but it didn't come just out of nothing. And I think that that process is extremely important to understand, because that's part of the gift, that such hard work went into this from so many different directions. And Pope Francis was the inspiration, because you go to the Vatican in part because it's so thrilling that you see that moral call. And so from every faith and every top scientist, they say, yes, of course, what can we do to help? And the idea that these facts are put in such a powerful moral language is the inspiration that pulls all of this together.
Thank you. It's interesting you're saying how thrilling it is going to the Vatican, because one of the sort of interesting juxtapositions in the encyclical to me is this exclamation of praise that starts it, and this tremendous joy and enthusiasm, to then go on to talk about some grave issues of concern. And it's interesting in the sort of evangelical dimension that I think you see in the encyclical itself, and then also in the reception that is received. And I'm wondering, Cardinal O'Malley, if you could speak a little bit to the pastoral concerns that you see at the heart of Laudato Si.
Well, first of all, I think that pastorally speaking, for me as a bishop and for priests and religious educators, the opportunity to be able to present the Church's magisterium to our young Catholics who very often have never read an encyclical or would not know one was, but to realize that the Church is just as passionate about this theme that is so important to them. And it isn't just a political stance, but it is an ethical and a faith position. I think that pastorally it's a great opportunity for us to help our young people to understand the great treasures of the social doctrine of the Church, the social gospel of the Church, which is, I always say, one of our greatest secrets, because so many Catholics are unaware of the extraordinary teachings of the Church on human dignity, economic justice, racism, a whole series of social issues that touch our daily lives. And so I think for us it's a pastoral opportunity. Certainly the pastoral concern of the Holy Father in writing this is to help form a world where there's a sense of unity and community, where we are together dealing with the problems of humanity. And of course, he connects throughout the encyclical constantly the question of poverty and if any of you have ever been in parts of the world where there is practically no water, and to see how people are eking out an existence, and those of us in the first world just turn on a spigot or go to the corner and you can buy a bottle of this water. For many people, this would be such a luxury. And so the Holy Father's emphasis on trying to call people together to look for the world's problems, the problems of humanity. The Jewish tradition has a beautiful expression. They talk about tikkun olam, repairing the world. Well, this is what it's about, but repairing the world together. Because if we don't do it together, it's not going to work. And the fact that the Holy Father cites the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew and so many other religious traditions, I think is an important indication of how the Holy Father is trying to get us to reach out and to work together for our common home.
One of the magical aspects of these meetings, which were called by Cardinal Turkson, who directs the Pontifical Council of Justice and Peace, is that there'd be a meeting about climate science in the morning, and in the afternoon, with the same participants, there was a meeting, or the discussion turned to the questions of human trafficking, the excluded, modern forms of slavery. And at the beginning, the scientists and the community practitioners weren't quite sure why these were together and what was the point about having these two sessions. But you saw the magic of this, that this was really about integral questions. And the climate scientists who study solar radiation and how it's being affected by greenhouse gases, and then listening to the change in the communities of the poorest of the poor and what implications were, and the feedback from the development practitioners back to the sciences was part of the magic of this. And this is really the message, as you said, Cardinal, that this is such a holistic and integral vision, and everybody feels empowered by it because of that. And just the design of putting people into these questions together has that effect of inspiring all parts of this discussion.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because there is this unity of thought that you're referring to in the encyclical, this connection, this common home, this connection between, say, natural ecology and human ecology. And you were commenting earlier on the difficulty for many people in understanding the reality of life for the very poor. And do you think that's one of the concerns, that repeatedly in the encyclical, the Pope refers to the disproportionate difficulties that the poor face in terms of ecological degradation. And do you think part of this is an attempt for him to try to get people to understand the nature of poverty and to try to make this a more pressing concern for people who are, for whom the poor are essentially invisible in many ways?
Definitely. The Holy Father so often talks about economic justice and the problems that poverty creates for the family, for women, for children, for the elderly. But here he's going beyond that and saying, well, we're concerned about the poor, but if you're concerned about the poor, you're going to be concerned about doing something around the environment, because this is what is drastically affecting their lives and causing so much suffering. And I think for a lot of people, this was a concept that they hadn't thought about, and the Holy Father certainly is emphasizing it here. And right from the beginning of his pontificate has talked so much about economic justice and even connected that with the gospel of life. But here he's going into some root causes of the suffering of the poor, and the degradation of the planet is certainly one of them. And
that features prominently.
Could I read a paragraph that I think is wonderful, and I'm going to make an advertisement for our program at Columbia. But paragraph 139, he says, nature cannot be regarded as something separate from ourselves or as a mere setting in which we live. We are part of nature, included in it, and thus in constant interaction with it. And I think the following is remarkable. He says, recognizing the reasons why a given area is polluted requires a study of the workings of society, its economy, its behavior patterns, and the way it grasps reality. Given the scale of change, it is no longer possible to find a specific, discrete answer for each part of the problem. It is essential to seek comprehensive solutions which consider the interactions within natural systems themselves and with social systems. We are faced not with two separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather with one complex crisis which is both social and environmental. Strategies for a solution demand an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and at the same time protecting nature. And this is the philosophy that, now my advertisement, we're trying at Columbia to introduce the concept of sustainable development as a new intellectual field also, which has that moral framework and is an integrated economic, social, and environmental analysis. So we're trying to show that these integrated systems can be studied together and studied within a moral frame. I don't know if my colleague Bob Pollack is here. Is Bob?
I think he wasn't able to make it. I don't think he's in the audience.
Oh, okay. So Bob is one of the leaders of this effort, and so we love this encyclical because we could put it in the recruiting brochure to explain the idea that we need an integrated vision. And I want to give one UN advertisement as well, because as you know, we don't hear enough really about the wonderful things that the UN as a crossroads of the world can do on the positive side. And not only did the world leaders adopt the climate agreement, but they adopted sustainable development goals. And I always give a homework assignment: go home, look them up, and know them, because they are the global goals for cooperation for the coming generation, and they've been adopted by all 193 governments. But they follow Pope Francis's call for an integration of the economic, the social, and the environmental. And you will not be surprised to know that the Holy See made very important contributions to the formulation of the Sustainable Development Goals, including the call to end modern slavery, which is one of the, all forms of modern slavery, which is one of Pope Francis's passionate calls on the world, and that became part of the UN's call as well. So this integral view, which is at the heart of this encyclical, is being taken up, and I think that it is an extremely fruitful way for us to get out of this trap that we're in.
Thank you. We appreciate your plug. You know, it's interesting. Both of you have spoken about the encyclical in light of the longer Catholic social tradition, and also as a sort of personal call to transformation on an individual and a social level. And one of the things that often happens is Pope Francis is often contrasted quite sharply with his predecessor. And it's interesting in the encyclical, while he doesn't quote Benedict frequently, there's a couple of sort of key moments that I found very interesting on that front. Early on, Francis notes, he says, "We have forgotten that man does not create himself." And he quotes Benedict and saying, "Where we ourselves have the final word, where everything is simply our property, and we use it for ourselves alone, the misuse of creation begins when we no longer recognize any higher instance than ourselves, when we see nothing else but ourselves." And then later on in the encyclical, at a sort of rather more critical transition point, he again quotes Benedict when Benedict said, quote, "The external deserts in the world are growing because the internal deserts have become so vast." And Francis there refers to for an ecological conversion and the need for this ecological conversion, whereby the efforts of believers' encounter with Jesus Christ become evident in their relationship with the world around them. And I'm wondering if you could just say a few final remarks about that connection between this sort of internal desert, right, and this sort of loss of a sense of transcendence with the sort of more general social problem that we see before us, and whether or not you want to speak to it on a spiritual level, also you, Dr. Sachs.
Well, first to comment on, Pope Benedict. They brought out a volume, just Pope Benedict's teaching on ecology. I don't know whether the professor's seen that or not. I'll try and get it. It's a very interesting work, but St. John Paul II also often talked about ecology and environment. And there's been sort of a crescendo that has led up to Pope Francis, and certainly Laudato Si is coming out of a very robust tradition, but has the great advantage of being an encyclical that is really going to be a landmark, because it's the first time that this has been dealt with as a single issue in the church, and has raised it up in people's minds. Because formerly, I think if you asked social justice committees in a parish to give you a list of all of the issues that that the church was concerned about, a lot would not include ecology, unfortunately. But after Laudato Si, that cannot happen. Certainly, the Holy Father has invited us to see creation from a faith perspective, and that we cannot see wealth and the natural resources simply as economic entities, but are part of creation, and there's a certain sacredness to it and a connectedness. And as the professor already indicated, that the Catholic social teaching is that there is a social mortgage on all wealth, and that is something that the goods of the earth are to support everyone on the planet, and they must be shared, and we have a role of being stewards. I think that theme of the Holy Father is a very important one, but we cannot look upon creation simply as something that is disconnected from God and disconnected from us. I think that triad that the Holy Father talks about, God, people, and creation, is very, very important, and that elevates creation. The fact that St. Francis saw everything in creation as a brother and a sister, whether it be the sun or the moon or the animal, in that we all have the same creator, and there's a relationship that exists because of that.
Well, I think we'll have to end here this evening. But on behalf of the New York Encounter, I want to thank you both, Dr. Sachs and Cardinal O'Malley, for a fascinating evening.
Thank you, Rebecca. Good job.